Cultural evolution. This is really kind of fascinating if you think about it. I was looking at an article. They did DNA studies on human bones that they found in Bulgaria, and what they discovered was the individuals from that cave where they found the bones and the teeth. The those individuals were related to very closely related to the Neanderthal man. Um, it kind of changes the way that they look at things. Not only were they genetically comparable to the Neanderthal man, they had some Neanderthal ancestry, but also they may have been ancestors of American Indians. Really kind of fascinating stuff. I'm sure we'll get more information on that in the future. But let's go ahead and get started and talk about evolutionary psychology, how things change over time. And of course, they have to change slowly. That's what evolution means. Different environments affect the ways that people go about living their lives. A good example is the American Indians. The American Indians that lived in the forests of the Midwest, where Indiana, Ohio, and that area is. There were a lot of medium-sized animals that they used as food: deer, turkeys, uh, pigeons. As weird as that sounds, passenger pigeons. Whereas the natives of the Southwest, there were no large animals like that. The people that lived on the Great Plains, they could hunt buffalo and they could hunt antelope, um, and that was their food source. Really kind of fascinating. You find a place that where you can survive. Of course, there has to be enough food to survive, and that is how you do it. And different environments have different animals that you can use for food, and different vegetable uh, sources that you can use as food. Some of the ways that physical environments affect cultures are quite direct. There are no large indigenous mammals on the Hawaiian Islands. This is about all they have, and of course they didn't hunt whales. This is a Hamahama Nuka Nuka Apua'a. This was a very colorful fish. There were geese, there were seals, but they were difficult to find. Therefore, the Hawaiians do not have any hunting traditions because they really all their sustenance came mostly from fish. The Kung of the Kalahari live in an environment surrounded by large animals and derive much of their caloric intake by hunting these large animals, including a lot of ungulates, a lot of antelopes and whatnot, but also elephants. The Kung have a strong hunting tradition, mainly because in order for them to survive in that environment, they needed to hunt. The kinds of foods that are available within a given ecology affect the kinds of foraging behaviors that people engage in. And of course, this is a picture of what you would find in where I grew up. Squirrels were fairly abundant, as were rabbits. There were a lot of berries and mushrooms to eat in that area because it's so humid. According to Gilmore in 1990, in those cultures where the environment is harsh and requires courage and physical prowess to secure a living, cultures of masculinity that value the strength and the toughness of males are more likely to emerge. And that would be where you guys live, where there isn't. It's a harder environment to live in. You need to find your food, whereas if you lived in the forests of New England or in around the Great Lakes, a little bit easier to find food. Places where large game is hunted, like the buffalo on the plains. Places where risky deep sea fishing is performed. On the South Pacific island of Truk, men traditionally had to go on dangerous deep-sea fishing expeditions to secure food for their families. The Truckees greatly value masculinity, which is manifested by young men engaging in frequent violent drunken melees with knives and clubs. In cultures where the environment is more benign and food is plentiful and more easily acquired, more androgynous gender roles are more likely to emerge. Men in Tahiti do not need to hunt and fish because fish are readily available in the shallow lagoons. There is virtually no warfare and feuding on Tahiti, and there is little evidence that masculinity is a matter of much concern with Tahitians. The harsher the environment and the scarcer the resources, the more manhood is stressed. Environment shapes lifestyle, and this may have been one of the reasons why the Vikings were such bold adventurers. Why in the world were they bold adventurers? Because they lived where it was winter, 7 or 8 months out of the year. It was a very harsh environment. They needed to find their food. They needed to conquer their food. Whereas farther south in Spain and Italy, in southern England, a lot easier place to live because the winter months did not encompass as much time, and therefore they had more time to hunt and find their food. In 1532, Juan Pizarro and 168 soldiers met with the Incan Emperor Atahualpa and captured the emperor and killed 7,000 Incan warriors. Within a year, the Spaniards won battle after battle against impossible odds and conquered the Incan Empire. Now, this isn't completely true. They also had indigenous allies that they fought with, but it was because of, well, we're going to talk about why in just a second. But of course, Heine leaves out the fact that Pizarro also had allies, indigenous allies. Proximal means direct and immediate. Proximal causes of Spanish success would be the Spanish political organization drew on thousands of years of written history, ocean-going ships, steel swords and armor, horses, and of course smallpox decimated the Incans as it did most of the indigenous people they came in contact with. Distal means long-term and indirect. The Spaniards came from a history of environments with food sources that supported large populations. The Fertile Crescent in the Middle East, wheat, barley, peas, and lentils, sheep, goats, pigs, donkeys, cows. Such strong agricultural endeavors enabled the formerly nomadic people to adopt more sedentary lifestyles, which in turn allowed them to seek scientific improvements, and therefore they did. The domestication of various animals allowed the people in the Eurasian area to live in close proximity with animals for thousands of years. Because of this proximity, diseases developed and were traded back and forth between the Eurasians and the animals, so that animal diseases now affected humans. Such viral problems as measles, smallpox, and influenza, and such bacterial problems as tuberculosis. These were diseases that animals had, and because they live with their animals, they were passed back and forth with humans. And of course, that's one of the reasons that we have just had a pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic. It was a virus that has been around for a long time. As a matter of fact, I ran into COVID when I was working in Germany. When I was in the military, it wasn't quite as lethal as this form of COVID, but it's been around for a really long time. But passing it back and forth between animals and humans, and suddenly we had a virulent strain that wiped out millions of people around the world. For thousands of years, diseases swept through the cities and towns of Eurasia, killing off millions but leaving populations of people immune to these scourges. When these diseases were introduced to the uninitiated populations in the Americas, the lack of immunity wiped out whole nations. The white clay people of Montana talk of 600 lodges being reduced to 60 when smallpox first struck their tribe. Burial had to take place in trees. There were so many dead. Normally they buried their dead in rock enclaves, but there were so many dead they had to start burying their dead in trees. China is a large country in Eastern Asia. In the north, the people eat and grow wheat. In the south, where it is warmer and more humid, they grow and eat rice. Because there is a vast difference between growing rice and wheat, the two areas have developed different social structures. Rice is cultivated in paddies, plots of standing water. There has to be sufficient rainfall where it is channeled through irrigation canals. This requires a great deal of coordination and cooperation between farmers. Rice farming is labor intensive, often requiring work by whole families. Wheat farming is done in fields that rarely require irrigation. A wheat farmer does not have to cooperate with his neighbors. Wheat farming is far less labor intensive. Looking at people from northern and southern China, researchers discovered that rice growers from the south showed more interdependent thinking styles. They saw themselves as part of a network. They were tolerant of nepotism. They engaged in more holistic reasoning. And so since you guys are a TikTok group, let's go to this YouTube video and it will demonstrate to you the difference between Northern Chinese and Southern Chinese.
You fight the darkness.
Please end the terror.
We thank you. Pre-order Diablo 4.
Oh yeah, okay. This is from the south. Somebody from the rice eating area. Somebody from the north, the wheat eating area. Wheat eater.
Come on, pussy.
Somebody from the south.
亲爱的，要不要来一点？
Or they eat rice.
就来一点点啦。
More collectivistic.
啊！
Okay, there's a reason why her face is all red. The reason is because people in the South, they react to alcohol by having it flushes their face. It's really kind of fascinating. Somebody from the North, lots of food, tons and tons of food. Look at that.
这是我特意为你做的。
哇塞，你好厉害呀，亲爱的。
哎，你这个怎样？怎样？哎，这problem。我要上车了，你我这 problem， 哎这。 亲爱的，我是不要看这个。
就是。抢我包！好讨厌！哇塞，你看这个男的长得很帅，有没有？
来的是我，你怎么舍得我？许多故事有伤心的理由，这一次我的爱情。
So Northerners are more individualistic and Southerners are more collectivistic.
One more time，今天要给他打死。
Okay. I watched a bunch of these. They're really funny. There's a lot more swearing. So okay. So as we noticed, the northerner, the wheat farmer, the people that come from the wheat region, a lot more individualistic, a lot more aggressive. People from the south, of course, because cooperation is needed in order to grow rice. A lot more collectivistic, and a lot less aggressive. Evoked culture is the idea that people, no matter where they are from, have certain biologically encoded behavioral patterns that can be evoked when a certain circumstance arises. When threatened, the capacity to act in an intimidating manner is universally present, especially when loved ones are threatened. Another example of evoked culture is attractiveness in a mate. People around the world prefer mates who are physically attractive. Attractive people are less likely to have parasites. Attractive people are healthier. Thus, humans have inherited preferences for attractive mates. When there is little threat from parasites or an unhealthy environment, other criteria can be used to select a mate, such as intelligence, kindness, and sense of humor. In areas that are unhealthy, attractiveness is of prime importance. When people learn cultural practices by social learning or by modeling others, it is known as transmitted culture. If you watch your neighbor growing tomatoes in a hanging pot, you have learned such planting practices by observation. Despite the fact that the Dinka and the Nuer have lived beside each other for hundreds of years, and they are both nomadic cattle herders and eat the same foodstuffs and descended from the same ancestors 1,000 years ago, their cultures are different. The Nuer raise large herds of cattle and live off the milk. The Dinka butcher their herds and rely on the meat. The Dinka maintain tribal relationships with the families they live near. The Nuer maintain kinship based on the male line. The Nuer are a larger and more militaristic tribe. The Nuer maintain costly and flexible dowry payments for their daughters, while the Dinka have small, flexible payments. Biological evolution occurs when certain genes become more common in a population than they were in the past. Biological evolution operates through natural selection. Natural selection is the evolutionary process that occurs under these conditions. Individual variability exists among members of a species on certain traits. The traits are associated with different reproductive rates. The traits have a hereditary basis. Let's go back to the young ladies. So if you were living in the South and you were a very aggressive individual, either you would change or no one would want to marry you, and therefore you would not be able to reproduce. If you were aggressive, if you were a passive person in the North, then exactly the same thing would happen. And this is how populations become very similar as far as their personalities are concerned. Fast-running antelope have an advantage in outrunning predators. The trade-off would be that their increased muscle mass would require increased food to maintain them. Slow-running antelope may be more susceptible to predators, but in time of drought, when the food sources are limited, they're more likely to survive than the fast-running antelope. Cultural evolution is where ideas are carried forward from generation to generation. Cultural evolution follows natural selection, as some ideas are more selectable in a culture than others. And two examples are religions, which seem to be in most cultures, and political structures, which you have to have in order to maintain an environment where multiple people can live. Copying errors are very common with cultural ideas. Copying errors or mutations are rare among genes. So it happens in cultural ideas, and these are bathing suits from 1875. As you can see, the evolution of the bathing suit, and you can watch the natural evolution changing with time. But mutations are rare. Genes pass very, very slowly. Genes pass vertically from parent to offspring. Culture passes horizontally from one person to anyone they come in contact with. Cultural evolution can be very, very rapid. And a good example would be the music that you listen to. Do you listen to the same music you listened to 10 or 15 years ago? Do you watch the same television that you watched 10 or 15 years ago? Do you even watch television anymore because of the internet? All of this has to do with cultural evolution, things changing very, very rapidly. While genes have been adaptive to be repeated, cultural ideas do not have to be adaptive. Even maladaptive ideas can spread, as with the headhunters of New Guinea, when half of them died due to degenerative diseases passed from diseased victims. And this had to do with what we came to call mad cow's disease. There is a human form of it, Jacob's, golly, I can't think of the other word. Creutzfeldt-Jacobs disease is the human form of it. And they were eating people's brains, and because they were eating infected brains, they got infected as well, and half of them died. But this was part of their culture, so they had a difficult time not doing that. Dynamic social impact theory posits that individuals come to influence each other, and they do so primarily in terms of how often the individuals interact, which ultimately leads to clusters of like-minded people who were separated by geography, cultures, in other words. Norms develop among those who communicate with each other regularly. In 2007, Callum and Harton, I don't know why I had a picture of Zac Efron. This is from a movie, and I don't remember what the movie was. In 2007, Callum and Harton followed a group of students for a year. The rescuers set a baseline by discovering the students' attitudes before they became students. The researchers discovered that the students that lived in the same dorms and ate in the same dining halls maintained similar attitudes no matter what attitudes they had before coming to school. The students began building microcultures within their living units. Cultures emerge when people communicate. Now, this is really quite important, and this is really kind of interesting because when I was in college, I chose not to be in a fraternity. Most of the fraternities on campus were segregated. In other words, they wouldn't allow African Americans to be part of they wouldn't rush African Americans. And because of that, all of the, only one fraternity on campus, and there were 13, only one fraternity on campus had anybody who was African American. That meant that the African American students from my year had to live in the dormitories, and that made the dormitories a bastion of civil rights, because that was the only place where we had African American students. Now, the odd thing is that people complained to the administration, and they were just totally blind to any of this stuff. They just ignored it. It was just the dumbest thing you ever saw. But it was pretty good for those of us who were looking for a well-rounded college experience because we were around, not only were we around a lot of very intelligent people, but we were around people that were diverse, a lot more diverse. And the dormitories became the bastion of all the progressive thought on campus, as weird as that may seem. Contemporary legends are simply fictional stories that are told in modern societies as if they were true. Booby-trapped Halloween candy is one such contemporary legend. There have only been 80 documented cases since 1959. Colonies of released alligators live in the sewers of New York City. New York is too cold for alligators to survive in the winter. The sewers are full of toxic waste that would not support reptilian life. HIV-infected needles are being left in coin return slots to contaminate an unsuspecting person. There has never been a recorded case of anyone contracting HIV from being stuck by a needle in a coin return slot. Researchers have found that rumors and legends are more likely to spread when they can evoke shared emotional reaction among people. The characters from fiction that are the most memorable are the ones that evoke emotion in us, such as Robin Hood. He steals from the rich and gives to the poor. Emotional ideas are more likely to spread through a culture than are unemotional ones. This is why our news is full of sensational stories of rescues, disasters, and wrecks, rather than the mundane things that happen every day. And this is a picture of an Italian town that was hit by an earthquake. That's what it looked like before, and this is what it looked like afterwards. The Fulani of Africa believe that the world was created from a drop of milk. Japanese mythology states that the world was created from brine dripping from the tip of the jewel spear of heaven. Judeo-Christian beliefs state that God created the heavens and the earth in 6 days. The kinds of stories that are especially likely to persist in our memories are ones that contain a few minimally counterintuitive ideas. Minimally counterintuitive means that they are statements that are surprising and unusual in the sense that they violate our expectation but are not too outlandish, such as a boat that looks like a guitar. Does globalization mean that we are destined to all become citizens of a homogeneous world culture? Probably not. The trend toward globalization is simultaneously paralleled by an opposing trend toward increasing tribalism. And of course, this is something that we have been seeing in the United States, especially since Donald Trump was elected president. The tribalism has become quite intense to the extent that they've changed laws that have been around for a really long time, such as the abortion law has been changed. And now they're talking about taking away birth control. Ethnically diverse cities such as New York, Singapore, Toronto, and Sydney are microcosms of the world at large in many ways. Each has many distinct ethnic enclaves coexisting within their boundaries. Thus, there are trends toward cultural heterogeneity globally, while there is a trend toward cultural homogeneity at the local level. When I was growing up, it was really kind of interesting traveling around the farming communities in the farm states, Indiana, Ohio, Michigan, well, not so much Michigan, Illinois, Kansas, because there were towns that had specific ethnic groups in them. I can remember towns that were mostly Swedes and mostly Scots and mostly English and mostly German. The town that I lived in was a Methodist town, so there were very few people that weren't Methodist. As a matter of fact, it had 3 Methodist churches. It had an English Methodist church, a German Methodist church, and an American Methodist church. I know that sounds weird, that if you were German, you went to the German Methodist Church, known as the EUB Church. If you were English and felt close to your English roots, you went to the Wesleyan Church. And if you were didn't feel that close to your immigration status, I guess you went to the American Methodist Church. But there was an organization they had. It was called D-Malay. D-Malay was for the kids. It was for the young boys. And I think the girls were called Job's Daughters, if I'm not mistaken. Anyway, they had a building, and that's where they that's where they had dances. And if you weren't a member of one, or if you weren't a member of the church, you weren't really supposed to go into that building. It was really kind of weird. I was only in there a couple times. And I was in there because I was dating somebody who was actually a member of one of those churches. Cultures that are so this has been around for a long time. So if you were Swedish, you went to the Swedish town. And if you were Norwegian, you went to another town. If you're German, you went to another town. And you really didn't feel comfortable in a town that wasn't your ethnic background. Cultures that are individualistic include a variety of practices and customs that encourage individuals to place their own personal goals ahead of those of the collective and to consider how they are distinct from others. We live right now we live in Lost Nation. Lost Nation was settled by a bunch of German farmers. And I feel comfortable around farmers. I'm okay. I'm not sure how they feel about me. Tracking, okay, unique practices in individualistic cultures, tracking of children at school, workers being given meritocratic pay at the office, meritocracy. College-age children being encouraged to move out of their parents' homes. These are from individualistic cultures. Employees being given individual cubicles, even though there is no privacy. People choosing to put their elderly relatives in retirement homes. Unique practices of collectivistic cultures. Collectivistic cultures include many cultural practices, institutions, and customs that encourage individuals to place more emphasis on collective goals, the goals of one's in-group. Children sleeping with their parents. Classes of school children being promoted together to the next grade regardless of the performance of some individual children. Marriages being arranged by parents. Companies compensating their employees on the basis of how long they have been employed. Extended families living under one roof. Many surveys reveal that Americans feel more financially pressed than before, even though real incomes have been rising and time pressures have increased as two-career families have become common. Putnam in 2000 speculates that individualism has increased by 10%. Suburbanization is another reason for increased individualism in the United States, according to Putnam, and this factor is also at 10%. Suburbanization results in people spending more time in their cars and in their homes and less time with friends and neighbors. The second largest culprit to increased individualism among Americans, at 25%, is electronic entertainment, especially television, which leads people to isolate themselves and engage in more passive forms of entertainment. Putnam in 2000 discovered that the younger generations even watch TV differently from the way their parents and grandparents do, as they are more likely to turn the TV on even if there is nothing in particular that they have in mind to watch. The older generations are more likely to watch TV only when there is a particular show that they want to see. Approximately half of the variance behind the increasing individualism rests with the different lifestyles between the younger and older generations. One of the most remarkable, and this is something that my son has been complaining about. My son is in his 50s, and he just started working at an organization, and he complains about the young people coming in. He says the young people coming in, you can't get them to do any work. And the reason you can't get them to do any work is because they consider other things more important than work, like social media. They want to interact with one another instead of get their work done. They think that that's more important, and it's driving him crazy. But at the same time, because he's coming at the same time all these other individuals are competitively, it makes him look pretty strong. And he's become a leader because he is older and he gets his job done. One of the most remarkable findings regarding cultural change is that people seem to be getting smarter. On average, across all cultures for which there is longitudinal data, people in the current generation have higher IQ scores than those from earlier generations. The trend of intelligence rising has been dubbed the Flynn effect after the researcher who first identified it. And there's the researcher on your right, the bearded fellow. And he looked at this twice. He looked at it in 1987, and then he looked at it again in 1994. A review of changes in IQ scores in 14 nations revealed that the average increase in IQ was between 5 and 25 points per generation, which makes more sense because it's easier to get information now. According to Healy in 1990, most TV programming communicates at about a 4th grade vocabulary level. Of men born in 1890, only 27% had more than an 8th grade education, and only 9% had any schooling after high school. Now, this was my grandfather's generation, and my grandfather felt that my father didn't need to go to high school. Nobody went to high school when he was a kid. If you made it past grade school, then that was a lot as far as he was concerned. He only had a 3rd grade education. My grandfather did. Of course, my father fought to go to high school. None of his brothers and sisters. He was the baby of the family. He was the last one, and none of them had gone to high school. But he was able to go to high school, and the reason he was able to go to high school is because he paid my grandfather room and board in order to go. So what he had to do was work at a grocery store after school and on the weekends to make enough money so that he could pay my grandfather room and board. At one point, he didn't quite make it, and my grandfather was about to make him quit, and my uncle came up and lent him the money to pay my grandfather off. And he did graduate from high school. And of course, education was very important to my father, and so he was very pleased when his children went off to college. In 2012, the percentage of Americans over 25 who had more than an 8th grade education was approximately 94%. 58% had some schooling after high school, and approximately 11% had graduate degrees. And of course, that would be me. Throughout the 20th century, until the last couple of decades, people were able to get by with as little as an 8th grade education. In the 21st century, it takes some college to get by, and there is an ever-growing proportion obtaining graduate degrees. Societies are always looking for scapegoats to explain problems that they don't understand. In Europe, a frequent scapegoat has been alien religions, especially Judaism. In the 14th century, the bubonic plague and other devastating diseases like leprosy swept through Europe. Now, the weird thing about all of this is that, this pits Christianity versus Judaism. Now, if you understand the story of Jesus Christ was convicted of heresy, I think, or he's convicted of something, and the Romans executed him. But according to the traditions today, it wasn't just that he was executed by the Romans. It was the idea that the Jewish people allowed him to be executed by the Romans. They're the ones that voted and allowed him to be executed. So that's one of the reasons. You would think that they would be really pissed off at the Romans, but that's not the case. Anyway, okay, so Jews have been targets for Christians for 2,000 years for some strange reason, even though Jesus, of course, was Jewish. So they have become the scapegoats, the perpetual scapegoats that have been used by Christian Europeans for an extended length of time. In the 14th century, the bubonic plague and other devastating diseases like leprosy swept through Europe, and guess who they blamed? Looking for someone to blame, Europeans began blaming Jews for poisoning their wells. These beliefs led to pogroms in most European countries, including Germany, Ukraine, and Russia. The pogroms erupted periodically into the 20th century, and the last one was just before World War II. And of course, you could call the Holocaust, where Hitler the Germans tried to exterminate all of the Jewish people. You could call that a pogrom as well, a massive pogrom, I guess. In the 1920s, the Nazi Party gained power throughout Germany based on the platform of blaming all Germany's problems on the Jewish population. Research by Voigtlander and Voth in 2012 disclosed that German cities that had Jewish pogroms in the 14th century were the same cities that had higher rates of violence against Jews in the 1920s and had higher support for the Nazi Party. Because cultures evolve from their past circumstances, the early conditions of a culture matter a great deal with respect to how cultures subsequently evolve. The critical role of early conditions is one important reason that cultural differences can persist across time. Boston was settled by Protestant Puritans. Puritanism emphasized respect for authority and the importance of applying wealth and social position to community goals. Many of the original Puritans were highly educated intellectuals, and they felt that their dreams of forming a utopia would emerge only from an educated population. Philadelphia was settled by Protestant Quakers. Quakerism emphasizes pragmatic concerns, individual equality, and tolerance. The Quakers built the University of Pennsylvania with a utilitarian curriculum with medical, business, and engineering schools dominating the university. The school received little community or financial support from the Quaker culture, as it had little trust in higher education. The Puritans built Harvard University using a liberal arts curriculum that emphasized community service. The university received tremendous community and financial support and is today the most heavily endowed private institution in the United States at $32.9 billion. The number of political leaders coming out of Harvard has been strong from its founding until today. Boston's culture has maintained its elitism, the Boston Brahmins, and respect for authority that can be traced back to its Puritan roots. Philadelphia culture has remained distrustful of authority and hard to govern, yet tolerant of diversity. As people immigrated to Boston and Philadelphia, they tended to adjust themselves to the prevailing cultural traditions as established by the Puritans and Quakers, respectively. Hence, the cities have been able to maintain the cultural traditions of their forebears. And if you look back at the Civil Rights Movement, Boston was one of the last cities in the North to support busing. As a matter of fact, they fought busing for years, just like the South did. But Philadelphia, of course, was one of the first cities to embrace busing. Often we try to figure out what others are thinking when all we have to go on is what people tell us, or our observations of how they behave. Pluralistic ignorance is a tendency for people to collectively misinterpret the thoughts and underlie other people's behavior. All these people really seem to have it together, and I still have no idea what's going on. Everybody's thinking the same thing. A good example of pluralistic ignorance was divulged in the studies done looking at the German people after World War II by Hannah Arendt in 1964. Arendt determined that Nazism was not followed because the German people were evil. It was followed because they were thoughtless and conforming. And of course, this is a famous picture because this is the one guy who's not saluting. And that is the end of the lecture. So I'll talk to you guys next week. We'll talk about something else.